The description is, we all know about our COVID-19 epidemic, but there's another epidemic many of us are not aware of, and that is our opioid epidemic. So Fraser, feel free to take it away. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Is this volume okay, Hashim?
Yeah, it sounds great.
Okay. As Hashim said, we all know about our COVID epidemic, but there's a second epidemic most people are not really aware of. Last year in Canada, an estimated 17 people died every day from drug overdose. And now in Ontario, the death rate is 57% higher compared to the same period last year. In Toronto alone, 520 opiate overdoses resulted in death in 2020, which was a 78% increase from the year before. And that's only the confirmed cases. The real number is undoubtedly much higher. And it's not just Toronto. In rural and smaller sized communities across Ontario, opiate deaths have nearly doubled. In Timmins, North Bay, Sudbury, and Thunder Bay, those are the top cities for deaths per 100,000 people. Now, the two epidemics are related because COVID-19 has exacerbated drug overdoses because addicts are shooting up alone more, and many of them have no contact with the services that could really help them. A lot has been said and done over the past decades about the war on drugs, particularly in the USA. But over the years, the war on drugs seems to have become the war on people who use drugs. They're treated as criminals. In the discussion later, you may want to comment on whether or not you think drugs for personal use should be decriminalized in Canada. Even some police forces have suggested that we decriminalize the use of drugs for personal use. Also, here in Toronto, CAMH, the Children and Adolescents Mental Health Services Hospital, the largest in Canada, is advocating for the decriminalization of drugs for personal use. What do you think about that? Well, you probably know about prohibition, the criminalization of ordinary alcohol in the States back in the 1930s. What happened then was that after it was decriminalized, the bootleggers then made alcohol more potent than it had been before prohibition. People could get stoned faster and easier. Now, that has happened with illegal drugs. Many drugs are now laced with fentanyl, which makes the drug much more potent and more deadly. And many drug users, unaware of just how potent fentanyl is, have died from overdose. Recently, synthetic opioids, and some far more potent even than fentanyl, have been found in street drugs by scientists at St. Michael's Hospital here in Toronto. The higher the potency, the easier it is to traffic, they say. So what causes drug addiction? What do you think the answer is? Most people seem to believe that addiction is caused by chemical hooks within the drug. And if you use the drug for a while, your body starts to really crave and actually need the chemical in a physical way. It's becomes painful to try to resist it. Scientific experiments in the 20th century certainly seem to confirm that notion. And for example, they found that when they put a rat in a cage with two water bottles, one bottle filled with real water and the other bottle filled with water laced with heroin or cocaine, you know what happened? The rat always preferred the second bottle of water, the one with the drug in it. The rats would drink from the drug-laced water over and over until they died, every time. There was one psychologist in Vancouver in the 1970s by the name of Bruce Alexander. And he noticed something about these rat experiments. He noticed that they involved just one rat at a time, put in a tiny cage by itself with nothing else in the cage except the two water bottles. Bruce Alexander knew that rats were social creatures, so he decided to do a different kind of experiment involving rats. He got some funding from Simon Fraser University, and he built a humongous cage that would easily hold 20 rats. His cage had 200 times the floor space of a standard rat cage. He put things in that cage for all those rats to do. Lots of colored balls to roll around, little tunnels for them to run through, wheels, and other things they could jump on and play with. There was lots of cheese to eat, and the rats could have sex whenever they wanted it. It was kind of like rat heaven for the 20 rats inside that cage. Bruce Alexander named it Rat Park. And oh yes, Bruce Alexander also put two big water bottles inside the cage, and you guessed it, one had water in it, and the other was water laced with the drug morphine. And guess what? Those rats preferred the pure water. They didn't like the drugged water. None of them ever used the drug water compulsively. None of them ever died from drug addiction. Why? Because they had happy and contented lives living with their rat friends. Even single rats that Bruce Alexander had isolated in small cages and fed nothing but morphine water for 57 days, they chose plain water after they were put in Rat Park. They voluntarily went through withdrawal. Rat Park was that attractive. None of them died. So maybe the theory about drugs having chemical hooks is flawed. What if addiction is more about the kind of cage you live in? What if addiction is actually an adaptation to your environment? Well, certainly that seems to be true for rats. So now the question is, if rats don't become addicted when they're happy with their lives, does that apply to humans also? Well, think of the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, 20% of all American troops were using heroin. Well, officials back in the States were immensely worried. They thought when the war ends, we're going to be faced with lots of junkies on our streets all across America. How many soldiers served in Vietnam? 2,700,000 Americans. Now, 20% of that number is 540,000. So what happened when the war ended and those 540,000 heroin users came home? Well, they were kept track of. And guess what? 95% of them stopped using heroin. They did not go into withdrawal. They did not go to rehab. It seems as if the horrible physical and mental stress of war, once removed, now that the war is over, allowed those soldiers to live at home with their families heroin-free. If heroin really had chemical hooks holding those 540,000 vets captive to drugs, could 95% of them just stop using after the war? Some more evidence against the chemical hooks hypothesis. If your grandmother at age 90 has a fall and breaks her hip, she'll go to the hospital for several weeks, and while she's there, she'll be given a strong drug to control her pain called diamorphine. Now, diamorphine is really heroin. It's better heroin than drug dealers sell because it's not contaminated like a street drug is. When your grandmother goes home after using diamorphine during her long hospital stay, has your grandmother become a junkie? No, she'll just stop using it when she gets home. She's not chemically hooked. Does what I've said about the rats in Rat Park the Rat Park experiment and about Vietnam War vets and about grandmothers who suffer hip fractures convince you that the long-held theory of chemical hooks inside drugs is what entraps us may be wrong. Or perhaps the whole drug addiction question is more complex than that. Because what about smokers who are addicted to the drug nicotine? Surely we can't say that all smokers are unhappy with their lives and, like rats, would automatically free themselves from nicotine if they just had a rat park environment to live in. I'm sure there must be many, many smokers who are quite content with their physical environment and with their lives. Well, what keeps them hooked to nicotine? Could it be that there's some genetic factor that predisposes some people to become hooked to a drug after they use it, whether it's nicotine or cocaine or heroin or whatever? I don't know. But some people suggest genetics may influence who becomes hooked and who doesn't. Whatever the cause, drug addiction is a huge problem that affects many lives. In the United States, it is estimated that 55 million people are using illegal drugs. The problem has affected my family also, because one of my 4 grandsons became addicted to Oxycontin as a teenager. He had hurt his back and was prescribed Oxycontin by a doctor. After a while using Oxycontin, he became addicted and then stole money from me and my wife to buy Oxycontin from dealers to support his addiction. You probably know that thousands of young men have died from Oxycontin overdose in Canada and the USA. Thankfully, my grandson is drug-free now after undergoing several withdrawal attempts. Today, many drug abuse experts acknowledge that drug and alcohol addiction does involve transmitters within the brain. Certain chemicals seem to latch on to different receptors in the brain, altering the way that users think and feel. The user becomes addicted to their high while using the substance, and soon has to use it all the time to cope with other feelings. Scientists today realize that addiction is as mental as it is physical. Humans cope with bad feelings by using drugs to smother their pain. Earlier, I asked you to consider whether drugs for personal use should be decriminalized. I know of only one country that has done that. It's Portugal. In the year 2000, Portugal had a horrible drug problem, one of the worst in all of Europe. 1% of Portugal's population was addicted. So the prime minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they set up a panel of scientists and doctors to review all the pertinent literature and figure out what to do. What they came up with was shocking to many. Decriminalize drugs, they said, all of them, and then use the money saved to help addicts recover and reconnect to society. They did a massive job program, a job creation program for addicts. For example, say you've got mechanical ability, they take that person to a garage and say if the garage employed him as a mechanic for a year, the Portuguese government would pay half the wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal would have a reason to get out of bed in the morning and feel connected to society. Maybe the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. Today in Portugal, you can use any drug you want to and not go to jail. And drug addiction has been reduced by more than 50% in Portugal since 2000. Overdosing is massively down. And nobody in Portugal wants to go back to the old system when drug use was illegal. As an aside, I recently read that Portugal also has one of the best records in the whole world for dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. After a very rough start, Portugal is now the most vaccinated country on earth, with more than 85% of its population vaccinated against COVID-19. The country has been reporting about 600 new cases a day, and that's just 5% of its one-time peak. So Portugal has done an amazing job, the best in the world. But back to my topic. What do you think about the supervised drug injection sites where addicts can go to receive free drugs instead of shooting up alone in some dark alley? In Canada, that started in Vancouver in an effort to save lives from addicts overdosing. We have them in Toronto also, but I read in the Toronto Star that some of the supervised injection sites may have had to close or move because of opposition from homeowners who just don't want them in their neighborhood. Toronto supports safe injection sites, even though the Ford provincial government does not. What's your opinion? As you can see, drug addiction is a huge, complex problem with no easy solutions. It seems that what has been done over past decades in the USA particularly, but Canada also, has not solved the problem. The war on drugs has really been a war on people who use drugs. That's what we've been doing for almost a century, punishing addicts and make them suffer so we can deter them from using illegal drugs. Is it time now to decriminalize drug use across Canada for personal use? What do you think about that? Thank you. I'll turn it back to